Hello, Imagine students and families. I'm Miss Thomas, and today I'm going to be reading Chapter 15 of Mr. Popper's Penguins. So yesterday in Chapter 14, Mr. and Mrs. Potter and Janie and Bill and all 12 penguins loaded up in a bus to go downtown to the Palace Theater. They're hoping that they can get some money by performing on stage, because as we have seen, keeping penguins in a home is kind of expensive, so they really need to get some money coming in, don't they? So chapter 15 is titled Mr. Popper's Performing Penguins, and in my book it begins on page 98. So that's what mine looks like. And here we go. Popper's Performing Penguins. At that moment, they were interrupted by the manager, who came in with a groan. "What's the matter?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "The marvelous Marcos, who closed the program, haven't turned up, and the audience are demanding their money back." "What are you going to do?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "Give it to them, I suppose. And here it is, Saturday night, the biggest night of the week. I hate to think of losing all that money." "I have an idea," said Mrs. Popper. "Maybe you won't have to lose it. As long as it's the end of the program, why don't we just have the penguins rehearse in there, on a real stage? We'd have more room, and I think the audience would enjoy it." "All right," said the manager. "Let's try it." So the penguins had their first rehearsal on a real stage. The manager stepped out on the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his hand, "with your kind indulgence, we're going to try out a little novelty number tonight. Owing to unforeseen circumstances, the marvelous Marcos are unable to appear. We're going to let you see a rehearsal of the Popper Performing Penguins instead. I thank you." So unforeseen circumstances are things that you didn't know were going to happen. Unforeseen, so not seen before. So you couldn't really predict them. Like they didn't know that the marvelous Marcos wouldn't show up. In a dignified way, the Poppers and the penguins walked out on the stage, and Mrs. Popper sat down at the piano. "Aren't you going to take your gloves off to play?" asked the manager. "Oh, no," said Mrs. Popper. "I'm so used to playing with them that I'll keep them on if you don't mind." Then she started Schubert's Military March. The penguins began to drill very nicely, wheeling and changing their formations with great precision, until Mrs. Popper stopped playing in the middle of the piece. The audience clapped vigorously. So vigorous means like with much excitement. So the audience is liking it. "There's more to it," explained Mrs. Popper, half to the manager and half to the audience, "where they form a hollow square and march in that formation. It's so late, we'll skip that tonight and jump to the second part." "You're sure you don't want to take your gloves off, madam?" asked the manager. Mrs. Popper smilingly shook her head and began the Merry Widow Waltz. 10 of the penguins now formed a semicircle, with Nelson and Columbus in their midst, putting on a wild sparring contest. Their round black heads leaned far back so they could watch each other with both round white eyes. So sparring is kind of like play fighting. You see it a lot with some martial arts. It's when you practice the skills that you've learned against somebody else. So you're not trying to hurt them. You're trying to show how skilled you are at doing some of the moves that you have learned. So 10 of them are standing in a semicircle, which is kind of like a curve like that. And then 2, Nelson and Columbus, are standing in the middle, and they're going to do their sparring act. "Gork," said Nelson, punching Columbus in the stomach with a right flipper, and then trying to push him over with his left flipper. "Gaw," said Columbus, going into a clinch and hanging his head over Nelson's shoulder as he tried to punch him in the back. "Hey, no fair," said the manager. Columbus and Nelson broke loose, as the other 10 penguins looking on applauded with their flippers. So the manager's saying, hey, you guys need to play fair. You're sparring. Make sure you're doing this nicely. Columbus now sparred politely with Nelson until Nelson hit him in the eye, whereupon Columbus retreated with a loud ork. The other penguins began to clap, and the audience joined them. As Mrs. Popper finished the waltz, both Nelson and Columbus stopped fighting, put down their flippers, and stood still, facing each other. So in my book, that's where the page ends, but I wanted to show you guys my picture. There they are sparring. Which bird won? Who's ahead? Shouted the audience. Gook, said all 10 penguins in the semicircle. That must have meant look, for Nelson turned to look at them. And Columbus immediately punched him in the stomach with one flipper and knocked him down with the other. Nelson lay there with his eyes closed. Columbus then counted to 10 over the prostrate Nelson, and again the 10 other penguins applauded. So prostrate means kind of like you're passed out on the ground. Prostrate. But he's still pretending. That's part of the act, explained Janie. The other penguins all like Columbus to win, so they all say gook at the end. That always makes Nelson look away, so Columbus can sock him good. Nelson now rose to his feet, and all the penguins formed in a row and bowed to the manager. Thank you, said the manager, bowing back. Now comes part 3, said Mr. Popper. Oh, Papa, said Mrs. Popper. You forgot to bring the 2 painting step ladders and the board. That's all right, said the manager. I'll get the stagehands to bring some. In no time at all, a pair of ladders and a board were brought in, and Mr. Popper and the children showed them how the ladders had to be set up, with the board resting on top. Then Mrs. Popper began playing the pretty descriptive piece, By the Brook. At this point in the act, the penguins always forgot their discipline and got dreadfully excited. They would all begin shoving at each other to see what could be the first to climb the ladders. However, the children always told Mr. Popper that the act was all the funnier for all this pushing and scrambling, and Mr. Popper supposed it was. So now, with a great deal of squawking, the penguins fought and climbed the ladders and ran across the boards in complete confusion, often knocking each other off entirely onto the floor below, and then hurrying to toboggan down the other ladder and knock off any penguins who were trying to climb up there. So there they are, climbing the ladder and sliding down, a lot like the slide here at the school, right? This part of the act was very wild and noisy, in spite of Mrs. Popper's delicate music. The manager and the audience were all holding their sides laughing. At last, Mrs. Popper got to the end of the music and took off her gloves. You'll have to get those ladders off the stage, or I'll never get these birds under control, said Mr. Popper. The curtain is supposed to fall at this point. So the manager gave the signal for the curtains to go down, and the audience stood up and cheered. When the ladders had been taken away, the manager had 12 ice cream cones brought in for the penguins. Then Janie and Bill began to cry, so the manager ordered 12 more, and everybody had one. Mr. Greenbaum was the first to congratulate the Poppers. I don't mind telling you, Mr. Popper, I think you've got something absolutely unique in those birds. Your act is a sensation. The way you helped out my friend the manager here shows you're real troopers, the kind we need in show business. I'd like to predict that your penguins will soon be packing the biggest theaters from Oregon to Maine. And now to come to terms, Mr. Popper, he continued. How about a 10-week contract at $5,000 a week? So my people who have higher up math, that'd be 10 times 5,000. Is that all right, Mama? Asked Mr. Popper. Yes, that's very satisfactory, answered Mrs. Popper. It's $50,000. Wow. So for 2.5 months' work, $50,000. Well then, said Mr. Greenbaum, just sign these papers and be ready to open next Thursday in Seattle. And thanks again, said the manager. Would you mind putting your gloves on again for just a minute, Mrs. Popper? I'd like you to start playing that military march again and let the penguins parade for a minute. I want to get my ushers in here to look at those birds. It would be a lesson to them. So, ushers are people who help other people find their seats in the theater. So they work at the theater and they help you find your seats. But they're supposed to be very polite and they're supposed to be very well-mannered and they're supposed to be very precise. And so the owner, Mr. Greenbaum, wants the ushers to watch the penguins to try and learn something. All right, Imagine families, I've enjoyed reading with you today and I hope you enjoy the rest of the book. Bye!